Hello, everyone. This is probably one of the last API reviews. We'll see. I don't think next week I don't think we'll have quorum anymore. Um, but this week, many of us are out, but especially the guy that normally does the German introduction. I can speak German a little bit, but I will not do the introduction in German. I'll leave that to Jeremy. All right, so then let's just get started. So let's just see who has context on any of those.
All right, this is me. So this is a configuration manager type that was added in .NET 6. It is both an iConfiguration root and iConfiguration builder, which simply means that you can add configuration sources and then reconfig from the same object. It's used in the new like minimal host web application builder stuff that ASP.NET uses in the new template. So this comes from a customer request. They were wondering how they like manually add sources. Right now, the iConfiguration builder sources property that's implemented by the manager is explicitly implemented. The reasoning for that is most people add sources via extension methods. So why have extra visible properties that may or may not confuse people who are using the object just to read configuration? Based on feedback, we think that was probably too cautious, and we should just make sources a normal public property instead of an explicit interface implementation. So if you scroll to the bottom, like that's the proposal. And yeah, there's been some discussion on the issue. There seems to be consensus that this is the way to go. I don't think it's that confusing to make it visible on the object.
And this property comes from an interface, right? It's defined on whatever the workaround described, right?
Right. So if you look at the
configuration builder,
yeah. So that's what it is. So it's still, of course, implementing that property for the interface.
Right.
All the existing code should continue to work, all the extension methods and so forth. It's just if you want to add something to the sources list directly instead of via a config list, and that's the other thing, actually. People tend to clear these a lot because there are default sources, right? Like app settings and stuff. Sometimes people don't want them. And so you might clear them in a test or whatever just to make sure your like in-memory config is the only config that has an effect on the test and you're not pulling in like environment variables or something. So that's another reason to make sources public so you don't have to do that kludgy workaround.
Yeah, I mean, the only downside really is that we can't change anything, right? It's basically, so, I mean, the problem with iList is basically that you're stuck with iList. So if you ever want to add more stuff to it, you can kind of hack it with extension methods over iList of configuration sources, but it's probably not what you want. And then I think my other question would be, does everything of list work? Can I insert? Can I shovel things around? Is that intentional, or is it really just for clear? Because then it might be easier to just have a clear method on the configuration manager.
Well, sadly, everything on list does work. As someone who implemented this, that was fun. But that's part of the interface. So yeah, I mean, if you insert or anything like that, we make it work. Order matters. We end up like reloading all the sources in the right order if that happens, but we make it work. Appending to the end is more efficient, but it all works. Yeah, I left a comment above. I mentioned we could add like a clear sources method or something to the configuration manager, but I do not think that's a better solution than just making the list public.
Yeah, if you already have it exposed in the interface, then it's arguably already public. It's just a question of like how many people ever consume this thing via the interface. So you can argue by making it public here, you expose it a lot more than you used to in the past. So I guess there's some argument in favor of saying, well, maybe let's think about that, but I don't have a strong pushback. It's just that in the past we were often bitten by things like, iNumable of something, or I list of something, or I collection of something, and then later on we said, oh, we wish you could add methods to that, and it's like, yep, can't do that. So that's why we very often say, let's define your own collection type, and then in V1 you have nothing on it, and V2 you add two methods to it, and it's fine. But all right, so then I guess unless somebody has objections, that That's going to be the API proposal.
That seems reasonable.
So, all happy with that? I guess I should do my usual thing here.
Looks good.
Because nobody really cares about
So just to clarify, you don't want to bring forward any of the other properties on iConfiguration Builder, correct? Like properties, just sources is the one that you care about.
For now, but mostly because of this clear scenario.
Okay.
I'm not going to say like I audited, like I'm not going to promise that we don't make any other.
Sure. But I
interface
guess
implementations.
as part of this work item, you don't see a need to bring the other ones forward at this time.
No, I don't.
But others, you just mean properties, right? Because it's the only other thing that's there, right?
Yeah. Okay, cool.
How does one add properties today? Are they extension
Sorry, how
methods?
does one add? Oh, like configuration sources?
No, properties, because that's the only other property that you have on iConfiguration Builder. So how does one add properties to that, or is that just a thing for all the extension methods to look things up as plumbing?
Sorry, I'm not. So you're saying?
So the interface today, right? The iConfiguration Builder interface defines two properties: the sources and properties.
Right.
So the
and
question
then
is,
add, it's all explicitly defined. Yeah. So properties is generally used by the extension methods to basically track kind of state.
Right.
So yeah, actually, like of all the members on iConfiguration Builder that we may want to make fully public, the other one would be the add method, but I'm not requesting that right now.
So then, out of curiosity, what happens when you call sources.clear, but then the properties still have state in them? What happens now when I then use the other existing extension methods? Are they then confused that they still have state left in the properties bag? Like, should they also be cleared?
Usually, like, I mean, that's really up to the configuration sources. Like, it's kind of like a bag. I've never seen anything clear properties when they clear sources, and I haven't seen any negative consequences to that. I'm looking at like how it's used today. So like the file provider configuration sources use it for their extension methods. It looks like it's for caching the file provider, which usually isn't a problem. I mean, usually that doesn't change in the, I mean, that can't change in the context of a build app. So long story short, like properties is used by extension methods. I've never seen any code ever clear it, even though clearing sources is pretty common.
Yeah, it seems reasonable. I mean, the only question would be then maybe we should have a clear method that just clears whatever state there is, whether it's sources or properties. And then if in the future we add something, it will also clear that. That would be the only sensible alternative design, I guess. But if there's no problem with not clearing properties, I think it's also fine to leave it as it's proposed. Can just add the question.
It's possible that the list implementation also could clean up properties when you call remove on a source.
Yeah, I mean that would be kind of a change in behavior from like the default like new configuration builder. Like if you cleared sources on that, it wouldn't clear properties. So that'd be the reason I'd be hesitant to like create a difference of behavior there.
Nobody seems to really object it. We might as well approve it, and then if somebody feels strongly, we can consider the other options here.
All right, thank you.
Alrighty, then on to the next one. I think I've read this one. If anybody else has context, I'm happy to talk about it otherwise. Nobody? Alright, so we have this thing which you may have seen Rosen added IntelliSense, and IntelliSense, maybe a bit confusing, but basically syntax colorization and completion support for strings that we know are regexes. And the way Rosen detects that is by basically saying, well, if you say, regex dot matches or something, or you call the instance method, and you pass an inline string to it, meaning a literal, then Rosen knows that that's supposed to be a regex. The problem is, of course, once you introduce local variables or you pass them to other methods that eventually get passed to the regex engine, then Rosen has no way of knowing that, right? It can't quite track across methods. And so the proposal that Stephen has is to say, well, how about we introduce this attribute that we can put on parameters or properties of fields and say, hey, we know that this is of a particular language kind, for example, regex, but it could also cover other things like, XML or JSON, for example, and then presumably we could enlighten the IDE or another analyzer to say, hey, you constructed what is supposed to be a JSON string, but it's actually not valid. So then you might blow up at runtime and give you more meaningful diagnostics or just plain syntax highlighting. And so the proposal is basically to have this attribute. It would just take a string that is the language. The configuration is convention based, right? We know that when you say lowercase regex, it means regex. And then this is how that would be done, right? And then we can apply this to other attributes, of course, and do useful stuff with that. Any questions for that?
What would this be used for right now other than regex?
I think right now just regex, but we have heard similar questions about JSON, for example, in the past, right?
You could also imagine, like just in an extreme case, our primitive data types getting some support like this. So, for example, say that you're passing a literal string into datetime.parse, then maybe we'll syntax highlight like the T and colons and hyphens and stuff like that inside of the datetime.
Oh, that's a good idea, actually.
You could have like string formats in general.
Yeah, like I know some other IDEs do that. I've never seen huge demand for it across our stuff, but it's an example of what could happen if you just take the idea and run with it. I mean, this seems straightforward. The only issue or the only problem I remember when this was first opened was that the attribute usage targets were maybe a bit too narrow for all of the use cases, but that has since been addressed.
The API seems fine. It's a shame that we have to use the word language in it.
Sorry, what was the last one?
I don't know. It just seems. I wonder if anyone could get this confused with, string language English or something like that for validation purposes or something.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I don't actually have thought about that. I mean, string languages seems a bit on the fuzzy side. I agree, but I also have a hard time thinking of something.
Yeah, I can't think of an alternative.
Do we need the word string in the name? Could it be something else like code? Or format?
Yeah, format seems worse because that actually is taken, right? Because it's like we have these formatting APIs where you can say, year, month, day or something, right? And it's not like that.
What about string syntax attribute?
Syntax I like. Yeah, syntax I like actually. That actually makes a lot more sense because that implies there's some structure, right?
Is this to avoid ambiguity with the colloquial use of the word language?
Yeah. Yeah, English versus German, right?
Right. Well, because we don't really use the word language within .NET to describe, spoken or written languages. We have a concept of culture, but not language per se. So I don't think it would be confused with other things under the globalization namespace.
I mean, I guess that's fair if you're an expert, right? But if you're not an expert, I'm not sure.
Well, I mean, hopefully you're not just spelunking around in the code analysis namespace.
Oh, that's true. No, it's just,
Yeah.
I don't know. I think the most usage of this attribute would be somebody looks up the docs of, let's say, regex.matches and they see the attribute applied to the parameter, right?
Mhm.
And I think if you would see if you would see syntax regex, you're like, okay, I think I know what that means, right?
Sure.
I guess if you see language regex, you probably also know what that means too. So it's not like.
I mean, without any context, if I saw the name string language attribute, I would probably assume it was some sort of loc thing. I hadn't really thought about the fact that .NET doesn't use language on any of its culture stuff, but
Yeah, I mean, there are some things called language, but they're kind of ancillary to .NET and not part of .NET proper.
Yeah.
But yeah, okay.
Does anybody have an objection to syntax?
No. And you're considering putting the consts in here as well?
Yeah, so the reason why I think we should put the consts somewhere is to avoid this whole thing of like people have to remember another API where it was applied to look it up, right? Like is regex lowercase? Is it uppercase? Is it mixed case?
And I guess we know for a fact that the analyzer or syntax highlighter will honor constants.
Well,
like it will actually do full symbol resolution and go in and pull out the constant value.
It doesn't have to, right? Because I mean, at the time the analyzer will look at the attribute, it's already evaluated, right? Because there can only be constants in
it. I guess I don't know if I don't know if the IDE is you should get the IDE team to confirm that they would actually resolve the value of what these constants point to.
Oh, I see what
because
you're saying.
because if they don't, then there's no value to us adding these constants.
So I mean, there's two cases, right? You either see a usage in source that is against an API that comes from metadata, let's say regex.match, for example, in which case it would read the metadata, and then clearly at this point it has been evaluated because it was burned into the metadata, right?
Yes.
Then there's the other case where you applied the attribute in your own source, in which case there's a symbolic textual representation for the attribute, right? So what I know about Roslyn is that they do have this notion of consts. So if you can actually ask what the const value of an expression is, if it has one, and that's what the analyzer would do, right? And so the analyzer wouldn't care whether you applied it as a literal or whether you went via whatever the attribute is called .regex, right? It would still be able to see that value.
Okay, so there is value to us adding this in.
Yeah, I think there is. I think the question is just where do we put it? I think putting it on the attribute is fine. We don't have to burn another type. Seems to be the obvious home. Just makes referencing slightly longer, but I think that's fine too.
Yeah, the only other thing I could think of is that if this ends up being a very long list over time, maybe we would want it under a nested type or something. We've done that before with things under the system net namespace, but I don't know.
Would there be value in calling it text syntax rather than string syntax? So I could imagine we have an API that takes a span of char, and we probably want to apply. I mean, there's already implicit conversion from string to that, and it seems it should just work as well, right?
I think the word string, like colloquially, is still correct there because people think of it as a string. You are passing in a string literal.
I guess that's fair. So then,
and if you're not passing in a literal, like none of this matters, right?
Right, because you have to apply to an attribute. So
yeah,
clearly that has to be literal.
No, I mean like the syntax highlighting at the call site like won't kick in if it's not a literal. Because there's nothing to highlight.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, yes and no, right? So I think that depends on how far Roslyn tracks it, right? You could imagine you have a local variable, and then the local variable is passed to the API, and then you get the syntax highlighting, when you initialize a local variable, right?
Sure, and then the local variable itself would be a string.
Right. Or, yeah, something that is convertible.
Yeah.
I mean, you could also have the debugger highlight strings that are evaluated at runtime, right?
So what do you mean by at runtime?
Even if you don't have a string literal, if you're constructing some string, some regex dynamically, and you're stepping through in a debugger, Visual Studio could still look at the full final string and highlight that based on this.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is clever.
Hey, Emo, the class needs to be renamed, right? Or
yeah, I'm typing the notes right now. Maybe I should just type them on the screen so you can all see what I'm doing. It's just that I really hate this text box. But I guess now I'm
that's
all the points.
fine. It's just that the class you kept it as a string language.
Oh, so you see the screen. Okay, now it makes sense. Okay, yeah, I copy pasted the other one.
Also, I posted a question. Do we need to have JSON in as a const right there? If it's
Emo,
not
you're
yet
typing like a cat.
supported?
Yeah, it's terrible. Right? That is how I type. This is why I don't get stuff done.
Were you suggesting that JSON not be included? Was that the suggestion?
I ask because Steven added in the description that if Visual Studio adds colorization for JSON, it would be nice if every API that accepts JSON could be annotated appropriately. So it sounds like it's not supported yet. So I wonder if we need to hold back from proving.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea.
I mean, maybe we can just approve the API and say if Rawson adds this, just go ahead and add the API.
I mean, the problem is that normally you want to avoid that in the sense that if tooling doesn't necessarily require APIs, right? But in this case, you would require the attribute application, in which case there is no value in us exposing the literal without adding the attribute to the required parameters, so that's fine. But I would not necessarily say let's only expose the API once tooling adds support for that, because they can do that, and then retroactively it would work for older versions of the platform as well, right? But in this case, that doesn't apply because you still have to have the attributes put somewhere.
That's fair.
Well, you would think that these attributes would be like the nullability attributes, and that you could just put them in a net standard application, right?
Right. Well, sort of. I mean, that would work for user code, right? It wouldn't work for framework code, which might be not that beneficial, right?
Sir, what do you mean it wouldn't work for framework code? Like I could imagine that system text JSON could just have internal versions of these, just like they do with the nullability attributes.
Right, but there's a difference between you being able to apply the attributes to your own code and you basically being like when you use framework APIs that the IDE also knows that they are nullable, non-nullable, right? That one we can't retroactively do.
Okay.
I mean, I guess we could ship a new set of reference assemblies that does that, right? That is possible. We just haven't done that. So we rename the language parameter to syntax?
To syntax, yeah.
And then probably this guy would have to be
And the constructor in line 13 needs to be renamed too.
Sorry, which one?
The constructor in line 13.
Oh, yeah. See, this is also how I type. I just type something that is in the. See, and now I'm screwed.
Do you have a delay?
And now I'm truly screwed. Connotation. Now I have to actually spell it myself. Any connotation to localization. Here we go.
If it's any consolation, you're better at spelling words in English than most of the rest of us are.
I still want IntelliSense for English, honestly. We should only expose the language constants as we are adding support for them, I guess.
Yeah. So we'll start with regex.
Yep.
Okay.
So everybody happy with that?
I think so, yeah.
That's good.
Yeah, that's not what I wanted. I wanted the list of labels. Sweet.
Nice, I can talk about this one. So the DLL import attribute defines default values for all the public properties and fields. Actually, they are all fields. And the idea here is for the analyzer to suggest removing any explicitly specified value if you're using the default value. And I have all the default values in the comments. The only one that is special, but it's just in an implementation detail, is charset, because it depends on the language, and calling convention depends on the platform. But they all have clearly defined default values, so I think it's pretty straightforward.
So let me start off by saying, like, I'm one of those people that is very explicit whenever I put a DLL import attribute on my code, because I want to be completely unambiguous at the call site as to what is taking place. So I will actually say things like charset Unicode, calling convention, win API, set last error true or false, even if it is the default. So is this going to be something that, like, what's the purpose behind this? Just to make the code smaller? Like, why do this? Why tell people you're being verbose and that's a problem?
I guess the main reason is to remove calls that are not needed. But if the user thinks that, if the user wants to be more explicit, then the analyzer can be ignored, right? We could also suggest the severity to be hidden and make it explicit if we want the suggestion to always show up.
Do we have other cases where we tell users you shouldn't be this verbose?
Yeah, I think if you set let me remember. If you have a Boolean property, if you set it to false, you get a suggestion saying you don't need to do this.
Like in the constructor, or
if it's a property and you set the default value after the getter, that's
Right.
when it tells you you don't need to do this.
Yeah, I think it's called redundant initialization. I think that's a built-in analyzer that does that.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if these analyzers are more hostile than they are friendly.
I mean,
because if you're not used to C# or you're not used to the syntax, like it might actually be beneficial for you to see everything written out clearly.
I mean, I'm also kind of if we want to do this, like what makes this attribute special? Like why would we not do it for all attributes? And the answer is because we don't know what the default values are. But I think it seems this is such a narrow and specialized attribute. Like I think having custom analyzers for specialized APIs makes sense, but then it should be more than just, you apply default value, which seems, the gain seems too minor to warrant the work, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think there could be value in like a general purpose analyzer that just suggests when you're setting something to a default value, but so maybe this can be reworked into kind of a larger concept to look at.
Also,
well, I want to.
This attribute is also a bad example in the sense that it's not actually encoded as a custom attribute, right? It's a built-in, attribute and metadata. So basically, it's a bunch of flags on in the row of the metadata table rather than a custom attribute. So specifying everything or nothing literally has zero impact on the code size of the resulting assembly. It has the exact same number of bits on disk.
There's also another related issue for Marshall as usage. The link is a few comments above, and the idea is to avoid bad practices.
Well, again, what is bad practice here? Because I'm also one of those people that puts Marshall as everywhere.
I guess in the case of DLL import, what would happen if you're invoking a method that ends with the W and you're specifying the char set to be non-UTF-8?
Well, so if it ends in a W, I expect the char set to be UTF-16.
Okay.
But that's the thing, right? I'm explicitly saying this is what I expect the contract of this call to be, and I'm using the attributes to do that. And maybe there's room for an analyzer to say like, hey, you have specified a char set that doesn't match the suffix of the API that you're calling. So maybe you should double check the documentation and make sure it's correct. But it seems like that analyzer would actually be helped by the fact that I'm explicit about the char set that I'm using.
Yeah, I appreciate Levi's perspective here. Sometimes it's good to be extra verbose just in the name of demagicifying certain APIs like pinvoke. So I don't know why I don't think that we would want to ever fold things back to default, especially with pinvoke.
Well, I guess the thing that's interesting to me is I think the phrase bad practice came up earlier, and it sounds like maybe there is some room for people to avoid getting tripped up here. But I don't know if are there cases where being overly verbose is the thing that's tripping people up?
Well, if it's incorrect, yes, right? I mean, I think you could make the argument and say the more code somebody is writing, you're effectively over-specifying the solution, which might result in conflicts where you actually get the wrong behavior out of it, or you get an imperformant behavior out of it, or whatever the case might be, right? But I think the problem is that, I guess the question is who's the audience of the analyzer, right? Because I think an expert arguably will apply these settings because we know that they are, or we think we know what we're doing, right? And so there's a chance that this actually has meaning, versus the person that just copy and paste code from, let's say, pinvoke.net or Stack Overflow or where else you get your signatures from, they might actually create things that are worse for them, right? But I'm not sure we can generalize this into an analyzer and know what the user is doing. I think if we know of certain settings being mutually exclusive or contradictory, I think it would make sense if analyzer that flags those and say, hey, you're saying this, but you're also saying that, and they can't both be true, so we will only do this, and is that what you wanted, basically, right?
So an analyzer like this would be more useful or more valuable if instead of suggesting just to remove the default values, it suggested things like what we mentioned about char sets. Hey, you're calling a method that ends with W. You should be explicit about setting the char set to something that is not none, or just to make sure you're using it correctly.
So, for example, I don't know what char set.
There's not much value in removing the default value.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not sure what the behavior of char set is. Like, if we already if you didn't specify it and we inferred based on how the method is named, then yeah, that would be useful to say, hey, either specify the correct one or don't specify one because we will infer the correct one. But you specified ANSI, but you're calling it a W API, so that doesn't make sense, right? So I think that I think basically the goal of analyzer would be to point people to things that are incorrect. Just pointing out things that might or might not be correct is usually noise, right? And I think over-specifying, you can argue, is this, right? Because there's nothing wrong with specifying all of these things, so long they're correct.
Yeah. Well, I think there is value to specifying something that might not be correct. Like there's something that is known incorrect, and there's something that is, suspicious, right?
Right. I mean, yeah, signal to noise ratio, right? If you're right 90% of the time, then it would still be okay, probably, as an analyzer.
Yeah, well, for P invokes, I would even lower that and say, like, if you're right, 60% of the time, maybe it's worth it.
Fair enough.
Okay, so maybe we can continue the discussion on this analyzer and make sure it has more value, especially when detecting cases where the usage may be incorrect, instead of just suggesting removing the default value.
Yeah, because
is that something that
I would suggest those two be separate issues.
Yeah, because the point of an analyzer in my mind is to help somebody write, more generally, is to help somebody write correct code, not to help somebody write smaller code. And
okay,
this analyzer, I really want to turn this into something that helps people be correct in their call sites. And if they can be both correct and smaller, that's goodness, right?
Well, Visual Studio does present you with, refactoring opportunities. Are those not done through analyzers ever?
Yes. If you can simplify your code, it's all.
Yeah, because I mean, I think there is kind of a general workflow in Visual Studio of trying to guide people towards more modern code, which often ends up being shorter code. So I could see removing defaults being in line with that thinking.
I like that you're saying that P invokes are in the same breath as modern code.
Oh, I was saying for like in terms of a general analyzer, not specifically for.
Oh, yeah, I get it.
I think it's a different purpose though, right? So usually those types of suggestions that VS makes is more for feature discovery. So it's for you to know about new things that were added to the language or so and so, as opposed to, hey, you could write this in one line as opposed to 3 or something like that. Like I've never seen those kinds of suggestions.
Right.
Usually it's like, hey, you could use a link query instead of what you're trying to do in here. Like, yeah, I don't know. I don't think it's the same.
No, that's a good point.
I mean, I could say it's the same as Visual Studio recommending you remove namespace prefixes and turn them into using clauses. That doesn't guide anyone towards a feature. It just shortens your code.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about this earlier, right? There are some cases where shortening the code is beneficial, right? Removing boilerplate. But there's also a slightly different connotation there, because I feel like a lot of the Rosin features that do that are usually trying to promote new language features that allow you to do that, right? So that means you in existing code you couldn't have used that shortcut because the feature didn't exist, and now they're promoting the existence of the feature and suggest these things, right? For example, I don't know, going from a.b equals to object initializers, right? Or saying, oh, maybe you should use a namespace, a file scope namespace declaration so you can get rid of all the indentation, for example, right? And arguably all these features are just doing what we said, shortening your code, but there is some value in removing boilerplate or noise. But I'm not sure that, a DLL import declaration would satisfy that definition of noise, right? Because as Levi said, like I want to be very specific about what will happen at this p-invoke boundary, because if I get these settings wrong, then, bad things might happen. But I may not even be aware that bad things are happening because it might just be super slow, or it might be, reading, incorrect memory, but that happens to work often enough that I'm not noticing, right? And so there's some value in doing that, which is very different from, promote this, to a using declaration over specifying the namespace, right?
Okay, got it.
So how should we do this then? Should we just close this? Because is this the suggestion, or is that or do we think there's something?
I think we can close it, and if we need to suggest an additional analyzer for specific properties, then we can open a new one.
Yes.
Alrighty. Okay, has anybody context in this?
I have some. I think it's quite simple one. Just adding a reset for the control flow builder, and which is used for the instruction encoder for metadata builder, and so that we can reuse the that object without newly creating each time, which kind of looks okay to me.
Are there other builders that have this pattern?
Yeah, Build Builder has this Claire. It's named Claire, not Reset though. Actually, in the instruction encoder, only these two builders used: Build Builder and Control Flow Builder. And
Build Builder, Clear is internal.
Yeah, for Control Flow Builder, it's internal.
Are there any public APIs for resetting one of these builders?
Well, Build Builder use some pattern using the clearing the internal collections, but for Control Flow Builder, even the internal API I haven't used, but it looks like can be used. For me, it can be named the clear instead of reset, just same as the other APIs. Other than that, it just looks okay to have.
So the way I understand it, so this whole namespace, right, ECMA 335 is basically a bunch of building blocks for effectively compiler authors to emit metadata, right? It's not, it's basically a more low-level alternative to reflection emit. And I think when we designed this namespace, it was basically extracted out of Rosin what they had at the time, and they cared about low allocations. So a lot of the stuff that we have in the namespace is, are structs already, and this is one of the few cases where it's not. And I think, I'm not sure this particular person works on Rosin, but it's very much in line with what the Rosin people have asked us in the past to make it easier to pool types. And so you can't really pool the type unless you can effectively clear the state of it, right? And so whether we call it clear or reset, I think is relatively easy to decide. I think the question is just for us: do we want to support the scenario? Is there anything about this type that wouldn't make it easily poolable? But I think all that this type does is it's just holds onto a bunch of things that you added to it. I'm not sure how you get anything out of it because there's no build method on it, but I suppose
I have a silly question, which is like I'm looking at source.net and I don't see any callers of the internal clear method.
Yes.
It's possible that there are callers, but they're not indexed. But let's just assume for a minute that there are no callers of this method. How do we know it works?
Is Rosin
I
indexed?
ran some tests. It's work.
Yeah, I think probably. Yeah, I guess. Does Rosin have internals visible too to this assembly? Do we know?
What was that?
Probably not, right? Yeah, I don't know how to search. Can I actually search it in source.rosin.io?
Oh, it's invisible, or sorry, its internals visible to system reflection metadata tests.
Here you go. And the tests are probably not indexed, right?
Correct.
So presumably now it's correct because the tests rely on them.
Easiest check, just add a throw platform not supported exception or something inside of it and run the unit tests.
I don't see the word clear inside control flow builder tests.
Oh, no, I mean, I used internally, I mean, locally.
Okay, and okay, so you were able to successfully reuse one of these instances, and it emitted, it emitted the correct. It had the correct behavior after you cleared it and then attempted to reuse it.
You mean tests pass? Yeah.
Well, the reason that I'm harping on this is we've had cases in full framework where we expose a method that was internal, and we just said, oh yeah, like this method we can just make public. But it turns out the method didn't actually work for anything beyond like the one very specific use case it was intended for. And then we made it public and the consumer was like, well, that was useless. And I just want to make sure that's not going to happen here.
I mean, looking at the type, it just seems like it holds on to a bunch of builders, right?
Yeah.
And you add to the builder by calling the add method. So given that there's no other state, I'm inclined to believe that clear will just work.
Yep.
Okay, and you said Voya, your own tests work too, so yeah.
Yeah, whether we call it reset or clear, I don't care. I think looking at the code, clear makes more sense because that's basically what this thing does. It just clears a bunch of collections.
Cool.
Are you happy with that?
Yep.
Just not that it makes a difference, but just all right.
That one is mine. So the purpose of this analyzer is to find invocations of path combine or path join that are one after the other, and they are related to each other. Like one generated string is fed to the next combine or join call, and only the last one is the one consumed. What the fixer should do is collapse them all into a single one, into a single join or combine, as long as the last string is the only one that is being used. And the main benefit is to reduce the number of calls and take advantage of the fact that we have params version in one of the two. It's join, try join, and combine the methods that would be receive this benefit.
I think this makes sense. This is a refactoring that I've done in old code before. I can't remember when we added the params API.
You have this listed as category reliability. Would this not be category performance?
It could be, yeah. I'm trying to remember why I added reliability. If I can find the descriptions in MS Docs, I can remember why I selected that. But it could be performance, yeah.
Well, because you're keeping the same behavior, correct? You're just reducing the number of calls.
Correct.
Okay.
So one question I have is, does the order of these two matter? So I guess that's a bad example because they are clearly, you have to have them in that order.
Yeah.
Well, I guess that it is always the case, right? So the statements have to be in the same order they're constructed, otherwise it doesn't work.
Yeah, and the string that you're feeding to the subsequent calls needs to be the first argument.
Right.
That's another restriction. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense.
Would the analyzer work if you're just using a single variable instead of a new string for each one? Like if I do path equals path.join, blah, 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 path equals path.join, blah, blah, blah. I don't know if that's common, but it's what I've done in the past.
People have done that, yes. I think that should probably work. The thing is that your special casing for saying is the variable being used would have to account for that, right? Because it's basically, if it's used after the last join, then it's effectively the same as only using the output of the last join.
Right.
I guess when I said use, I meant modifying the value. No, actually, no, never mind. Any kind of consumption, even if you're just reading the value, if you're expecting
a
particular value, then it would change.
This is this case here, right? But if you assume that they're all the same variable, right, then this can only read the last output, right? The fact that the same variable is used here is meaningless because you overrode the value here and then here again, right? So that's kind of the why if you don't special case a single variable case, it wouldn't work.
Yes. That case is the first string, and it would still compile if you apply the fixer, but the result would be different. And you wouldn't be able to even consume second if that was the argument for console write line, because it would be removed. So
yeah, I think this makes sense.
Right.
Yeah, I like it.
My only question is this something we could generalize, but I don't know how we would do that.
Do we have a similar thing for string.concat?
I can't tell. I remember we approved analyzers related to concat recently. Sorry, what were you going to say, Booyah?
I think we closed it because it will be very difficult to track all the concatenation. Something like that, I think.
Yeah, the concat case was a bit more complicated, but I don't remember the details.
Is it more complicated? I mean, it seems like largely the same problem.
I don't know if it was the exact same problem. That's a thing.
Okay.
So if the strings become concatenate with the plus sign, then
Yeah, there may have, because string concat uses the operator plus, there may have been some kind of interesting ambiguity as to the order of operations for evaluation, something like that. I'm spitballing here, but it wouldn't surprise me.
do we want to check only local variables or?
Sorry, what was that?
Do we want to check only local variables or global too?
You mean if the thing that is being assigned to is a property or a field somewhere?
Yeah,
That's an interesting question. I mean, I would say.
it would be quite expensive to make it.
I would say.
I mean, if it's a
no.
property, I don't think we can do anything. But a field, I don't see why we couldn't apply this.
Well, the problem is. So I guess it depends on what your definition of is used is, right? Because if this is a field, right? If X is a field, right? Then if the code is multi-threaded, you can observe every single assignment, right? So
yeah, but we have kind of strict ordering points though to know when X would be invalidated by another thread in that case. If those don't exist, like in this case, if it's just a field, then the compiler is completely free to assume it's single-threaded.
So we should restrict it to variables created in the same context. And
yeah, I think to me it makes sense to restrict it to locals because.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole point is to just get rid of redundant assignments, right? Really. And redundant string creation, right? So that, like, as soon as you have fields or properties, I mean, presumably you have those because you want to access these individual fragments, right?
I mean, yeah, if you're assigning to multiple fields, then yes. But if you're folding over just one single field assignment, like you have in this special case option, it seems doable then.
Right, but that seems like dumb code. It's like I'm not sure it would help people. Right.
I mean, let's say you have a constructor that's creating a path in a field. It would be very reasonable to do, underscore x equals path.join.
I guess, yeah, I can see people doing that. It still looks dumb, but yeah, I can I can see why you would do that.
I mean, I don't think it has to be done in view one of the analyzer. I think it would be useful if I don't know how difficult it is to add such a thing.
I think it's good to keep it simple now, and if we ever consider adding more complex cases, I guess we have to bring them to the API proposal meeting, right? If we have to expand an analyzer. Because I'm not sure about that, but if we ever need to expand them, then we can just create a new issue explaining why and if it's feasible. But for now, it's good to keep it simple.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would think that anything that would involve a behavioral change should probably have an associated issue, not just a PR. And then that issue would probably go through here because it would be a breaking change.
Okay.
Well, it wouldn't be a breaking change, right? It's it might cause one if you apply it, but that's true of almost everything, right?
Sure. Yeah. By the way, Mo, I'm not sure if you saw in Teams chat, but it looks like this would be performance, not reliability.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Carlos found the link to all the different descriptions.
And the severity would be info, I guess. I don't think there's a need to set a warning to the user. Info is good enough, right?
Yeah. Do we actually have any warning performance analyzers?
No.
Okay.
Always info.
Okay. So there you go.
Okay. So then we approve it as with these modifications, right?
Do you know of any oh, Boya just sent the link for the string proposal. Awesome. Do you know of any other cases where any cases within the libraries or application code which would immediately ping on this analyzer? Like, do you know how much churn turning this on might cause us?
I mean, we still have the same test, right? That we do it on system runtime and not system runtime, on the runtime repo and see what happens, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't expect this to ping a whole lot in the runtime repo, just because I don't think this is a pattern that we would do ourselves a whole lot. But I wonder if other repos within .NET that more closely resemble application code would start pinging on this.
Yeah, probably not for path.join, right? But for string concat, I could see us doing that, right?
Sure.
But yeah, paths are usually not. I mean, we usually just take them as gospel. We don't modify them. Alrighty.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, anybody context on this?
It looks like we're just making the APIs a little more consistent. Makes sense to me.
Yeah, a case of a missing overload. Cool.
So where does rectangle X, rectangle F live? Drawing primitives. Interesting that exists in .NET Framework since V1. See, I always thought that all the float burst things came from WPF, but that can't be true if it's in .NET Framework V1. Yeah, does graphics have any APIs to take floats today?
Yeah, like I'm looking at draw arc, draw Bezier, draw closed curve. Like those all take point F and point as overloads. Draw ellipse takes a rectangle and a rectangle F.
Oh yeah, you're right.
Hey, I just joined.
Hello.
Is there a fill ellipse that takes a rectangle F?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean,
yeah, it looks like this was just an oversight.
Yeah, it looks like it, right? I mean, the examples is pretty compelling, right? You have fill rectangle that takes them as rectangle F.
Mm-hmm.
But then for draw rectangle, we said, oh no, that one, you can't possibly have one that takes rectangle F.
Yeah. Especially since there's an overload that takes single precision floating point values.
Yeah.
That definitely is a strong indication that this is just an oversight.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I agree.
Is there a dog in the background, or is there some heavy construction going on? I think they would be on Santi's side.
Oh no, someone in the kitchen
Oh.
playing with boxes and Tupperware.
Awesome. The other one that looks like it might be missing an overload is oh man, where were you? Phil Pie.
That must be a very popular API.
Is there a system of baking?
So I see that Phil Pie has an overload that takes a rectangle and an overload that takes a bunch of singles, but no overload that takes rectangle F. So it looks like it might fall under the same bucket. And that's the only other one I see.
It also has an API that takes floats for X and Y.
Mm-hmm.
And for the width and height.
Yeah, which is the rectangle F struct, right? Just decomposed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so at the end, the rectangle F overload goes down into this one.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, if we wanted to, be air quotes complete, then maybe we would do draw rectangle and fill pie at the same time, even though no one's asking for it. Otherwise, this seems straightforward enough.
Yeah, and also to make a stronger point, fill ellipse also has rectangle F overload.
Oh, good point. Yeah.
Looks good.
Yeah, seems like a no-brainer. I mean, there are some other overloads here, like this enumerate meta file. Does this have, like, at least I can't quite see what they're doing, but it seems like they also have, oh, never mind, they're not drawing methods.
Well, it looks like they already have a ton of overloads that take point F, rectangle F, and so on.
Yeah.
There are some other methods that don't have floating point overloads, such as copy from screen, but I'm pretty sure that's because you can't specify subpixels. So it wouldn't make sense to take floating points.
Right. So we think these are all the overloads. I mean, probably would go if somebody would spend 10 more minutes on it, but other than that, seems fine.
I'm looking at all the graphics over APIs, and I haven't found any other that makes sense.
Cool.
Alrighty then. Oh no.
Is this a stream one?
Sorry, what?
The stream one.
Yeah.
I have a feeling we might want to wait until the new year to handle this, just because I'm pretty sure Jeremy especially is going to have some thoughts. If I can put words in his mouth for a minute, I'm pretty sure that he would say that these APIs are by and large valuable, but I imagine he's going to have feedback on things like the parameter names and specific behaviors of them. One of the things that we had discussed in this API is if you look at the hash, if you look at things like HMAC SHA-256, and you'll see that the first parameter key is a memory of byte rather than a span of byte. That makes me very sad because that parameter really should be a span, not a memory. But it's a memory to work around a compiler issue. So I have a feeling that he might have some takes on stuff like that.
Makes sense.
And the compiler issue is that
memory, presumably because of using the async keyword.
Yes, because even though the data doesn't need to survive across the async boundary, the compiler won't let you specify a span at the call site if you're awaiting the return value. Because
so that's
the
an implementation issue, though, right? That's not an API issue.
No, that's
like
a
the
compiler.
API, if this could be span.
It could be span, except for the fact that the compiler won't compile the caller, which is a problem.
It won't compile the caller?
No, as soon as if you make a method async, the compiler doesn't allow if you have, for example, ref parameters or parameters that are ref structs.
Yeah,
no, I understand that, but I'm saying that async is an implementation detail. It's not an API surface detail.
It's not the async, it's the await that's the problem, because even though you're only if you have a caller and you declare a span in a method and then you await something that consumes that span and then you don't use a span anywhere else for the rest of the method, you would think that, well, the span won't get promoted, right? Because it doesn't survive across the await boundary, but the compiler still throws an error anyway.
Yeah. So it's a conceptual issue in the sense that you have a method that is async, so you want to drain the stream asynchronously, and then once you're done, you want to write the data to a span destination, right? And there is really no implementation we could use to get around this compiler limitation, if that makes sense. So basically, that's why it's not. It's an implementation level detail, but it's not really something we can work around easily.
Yeah, and it makes me a little nervous because it's affecting the API surface in order to work around what appears to be a compiler issue. And I would rather just make the compiler make the scenario a little better,
right,
so that we can use the more correct API. But yeah.
No, that is something we could discuss with them. I think last time I had this chat with Jared, he was not opposed. It's just work, right?
Yeah. So that's another reason that I think we should probably hold off on this. Because I think we should have those conversations with the compiler team as well.
Yeah, seems reasonable. And I think we are done. I think this was the last open one. Unless somebody has something urgent, that's it for this year.
Yay.
Alrighty,
Cool.
then I will cancel the next one, and I think the one after, and then I think we're in the new year. Alrighty. Happy New Year. Happy holidays, whatever you're doing. And then I see you next year.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.